Okay, welcome to this video on Friedrich Schleiermacher, the pioneer or originator of modern, or as it's also known, liberal theology. I've done a prior video on his biography and conceptual context. I'll assume you've watched that. And this will be the first part one of two videos on his major theological themes in his thought. Once again, all page references here you'll find are from this excellent text by Keith Clements, which is worthwhile having in your video library. I guess I'll show again in case you didn't see the early video. This is his magnum opus, The Christian Faith. Wrote it in 1821-22, and then a major revision in 1831 and 32, just a couple of years after the death of his 9-year-old son, and just a couple of years before he would die at the age of 65 from pneumonia. Obviously, this is huge, and this is an excerpt not only from The Christian Faith, but from other writings of Schleiermacher, which have proven to be especially significant over the years. So, again, I highly recommend the Clements volume. All right, so we'll start out from The Christian Faith with maybe one of Schleiermacher's most famous ideas, and the starting part of his theology is this feeling of absolute dependence. Now, this idea is at the foundation of Schleiermacher's theology, and the feeling of absolute dependence is another way of the naming of one's being in relation with God. In my opinion, Schleiermacher's entire theology can be seen as an attempt to think through and to justify with rigor, in accord with modern philosophy and science, his experience of faith, salvation, assurance, koinonia, that he experienced as a teen in the Moravian community, which became his de facto family. Now, the feeling of absolute dependence, awareness of that, which is awareness of being in relationship to God, is for Schleiermacher the essence of faith. In the final analysis, I want to say I do not, it's supposed to be a not in there, I do not find his theoretical moves to be sufficient, but they are still informative and move us in many ways in a helpful direction. In my own work, I go from Schleiermacher to Husserl to Heidegger to Levinas, and then modify Levinas in a similar trajectory. But in that sense, there's an indebtedness to Schleiermacher. So, he's starting here. This is from these first pages. They're in the feeling of absolute dependence from the Christian Faith. He starts with any actual consciousness. This is phenomenology. He wants us to start out by reflecting. As he talks about this, he expects people to think for themselves about where they are. This is his starting point. This is what makes it phenomenology, as he's starting with a very precise reflection on our experiencing of being in the world. And the dynamics of knowing and being. And I have the hyphen there to emphasize that this is not being as some abstract noun. This is actually the movement of being. There's a kinetic emphasis already here, which moves from the abstractions and the sort of concreteness you get, a misplaced concreteness in terms of its relationship to reality, in some forms of empiricism. All right. And he wants to say there, every consciousness of self is at the same time consciousness of a variable state of being. In other words, as I think about myself, I'm my feelings are changing slightly. I'm cold, more or less hungry. Thinking this thought, then that. I mean, the state of our being is variable. My hands are moving. I'm in a different position. So the consciousness of self at the same time of a consciousness of a variable state of being. But insofar as it's my being and it's me, right, or you, there's a sense of a consciousness of a self. But a self that's variable. And so then you get this, therefore he moves to, and here's this very basic level of an identity, which is a constant, and at the same time a variability. He says he expects us to, if we just reflect upon ourselves, to have this same sense. More than that, he says, as we think about ourselves, we'll realize there's a non-self-caused element and a self-caused element. I mean, there's the ways in which what I am are in no way related to anything that I have chosen. And here with self-caused, I think Schleiermacher has in view what we would mean by free will. To be technical, in the incompatibilist sense of philosophy, what everyone normally means just by free will. And this would be consistent with the Kantian thought predominant in the day. And so there's the parts of myself, where I've chosen to go to college, how I've chosen to eat, how I've chosen to exercise, all these sorts of things that are a part of, my identity and what I am as a self, which are related to my free will. But then there's all these other parts of me, which I just find myself with. When I'm born, where I'm born, my national identity. All sorts of things. Everything that you would attribute normally to nature and nurture, right? This in later terminology. He's of course before Darwin. We don't have this sort of language yet. So again, he's going to expect this to also be fundamental to how we think of ourselves. So he says in consciousness, further, there are two elements. There's also coexistence with an other, and an existence of the subject for itself. In other words, I never just think I by itself. It's always I in contrast to others. And not just other people, but the rest of the world, that which is, this is my body, that is not my body. This is me, this is you, here's this animal, this tree. This is then going against the radical Cartesian atomism of the I think, therefore I am, where Descartes imagines it's just an I think. Schleiermacher is saying, no, already in that I, there's implicitly you, others. It's I and others. And this other is everything else in the world. And it's co-originate with consciousness. So there's no time at which I think I, when I'm not thinking I in a world. The two come together, come at the same time. They're given together. So there's in consciousness two elements: a coexistent with an other, with others, or an other as the world, which is full of others, and an existence of the subject for itself. And again, he's expecting these to be rather fundamentally acknowledged. All right. Okay. So, building on this basic phenomenology of the self, he's going to talk about receptivity and activity, which is going to kind of go along with the non-caused element and the self-caused element. But it's kind of that in action. So on the one hand, as I move through, I'm receiving input. Like I just glanced over here because someone ran by my window, right? That's receptive. It came at me. And then there's activity because I decided to look back and keep talking. So there's in all of us, as we move through the self, we have all these senses of an identity and a variable, of a non-self-caused element and of a self-caused element, of a coexistence with an other as well as an existence of the subject for itself, and as a way in which there's a receptivity and there's an activity. However, the receptivity is prior and primary. There's never activity. I never am just sheerly acting without any prior receptivity. This is a sense in which I find myself, from my very first glimmerings of consciousness, already receiving from the world, and then distinguishing myself from it in those ways. And in relation to all of this, then, I'm going to have a feeling of dependence, because in a way I'm dependent upon all the rest of the world, and all the chair I'm sitting on, the food I eat, the culture I was born in, all these sorts of things, a feeling of dependence vis-a-vis all sorts of individual things. And Schleiermacher is going to say, at the most radical extreme, even the most distant star, there's this, at the most radical remove, there's some way in which I'm connected to the entire rest of the cosmos. And I am dependent on it to greater and lesser degrees. I'm far more dependent right now on this chair than that most distant star. But in a complete accounting, the entire cosmos, all of nature, now in the modern sense, he's in our modern world, all of nature would be in play. But also a feeling of freedom, right? That I'm not simply dictated by that, I'm receiving it, I'm dependent upon it, but also I have the initiative, I can act. and create myself. This is him kind of unpacking what he thinks is fundamental and to any kind of analysis of the self. He's doing this then differently, but in a similar way to his colleague Hegel, who's going to make similar moves but draw very different conclusions. What's distinctive here, and what makes this a phenomenology, and what makes him so distinctly a modern philosopher is this is the fundamental character of his appeal in his analysis, trying to do theology, which in this sense is theology or philosophy. So in a sense, this would be philosophical theology in a later terminology. So you have a feeling of dependence and a feeling of freedom. And the feeling here is not an emotion, but it's a reflective awareness. Here again, it's phenomenology, a la phenomenology, that cannot be thought otherwise. For instance, neither you and I can, I've already said this, contrary to the radical atomism of Descartes, I think ourselves wholly singular, apart from thought of context of other. Nor can you and I think without being aware that thinking is something I am doing. But even as something I am doing, there's a way in which I receive the thinking. There's something I can't undo there. I can't stop being conscious. You can try to stop thinking. You can't do it. So in this sense, it's not self-cause. It's not an aspect of freedom. It's an aspect of dependence. You can direct your thinking, but you can't simply stop thinking. All right. So think feeling of dependence and feeling of freedom as one. Obviously, I'm quoting now. Think feeling of dependence and feeling of freedom as one, and then the total self-consciousness made up of both together is one of reciprocity between subject and the corresponding other, which is all the other, which is other than me. So the corresponding other means is that your other is different than my other. Every individual has a different other. I'm a part of your other, and you are a part of my other. Right, so I have a feeling of dependency, a feeling of freedom. I think these as one. That's what I am, but in a relationship of reciprocity, right, between that which is other. And he says reciprocity is the right term for our self-consciousness in general. And again, this is to move away from the radical atomism of the Cartesian I. I just never understand myself in isolation. I understand myself wholly and from the beginning in reactions from others, perceived reactions from others, perceived reaction from the other things that surround me. So reciprocity is built in from the beginning, and we develop our unique selves then as spontaneous, free, that which it comes from us, activity, operating within the bounds of a prior surrounding context upon which we have dependency. Okay, so that's just kind of basic picture of the self. So you have a feeling of dependence and a feeling of freedom. To think both spontaneity and dependency, where the dependency is the total outside is one, together is to think world. And all world is relative, dependence, independence. Now, this is a harder idea than it sounds like, because most of us are already in another philosophy. It's not that you do or don't do philosophy. It's the degree to which you are aware of the philosophy you inhabit and think through, or don't, right? So when we say world, at least in the modern West, we tend to take that as somehow a given that's out there and objective. And for Schleiermacher, that's not something we have established yet. That's not something that's out there. So in reality, he says, when what is world for me is everything that's other than me. And in that sense, all in the world is relative dependence and independence, and the world includes me, right? So world is a construction. He's not denying a real world. But he's saying insofar as any of us think world, the world we think is a construction, and the fundamentals of the construction are what he's just outlined in terms of me and other. which means world in a certain sense is relative to every eye. But this is not a radical relativity because, of course, he's talking about us all having the same sort of experience of a self and self-consciousness, all relating to a common other, which we understand as world from our perspectives. Heidegger later will talk about this in terms of worlding with far more precision. But let me just throw that in now. This thing is now. So, because I'm trying to get the feeling of absolute dependence. So there's no absolute freedom because for every actual temporal consciousness, we all appear within a world. So the spontaneity, the way in which we, to use another Heideggerian term, the way in which we find ourselves thrown, right? We emerge from the first to consciousness already being given categories and a certain form and certain potentialities by which we understand ourselves. So there's no absolute freedom because the spontaneity, our freedom, manifests within a prior context of receptivity. That's which we find already as we emerge into the world. And again, later, Heidegger's going to talk about this in terms of our thrownness. I already come up with categories. I might be able to think differently about the categories over time, but at first I have to think in the categories that are the categories of my day, to which, in and through which I come into being or consciousness. Okay, so there's no absolute freedom, but is there absolute dependence? And here is where he's going to say yes, but absolute dependence is different than relative dependence, right? And so absolute dependence is not something we have with regard to anything given in the world. In the world, the feeling of dependence is always experienced together with the feeling of spontaneity. And it also, our feelings of relative dependence, Schleiermacher says, always happen within things that are in our world. But he says there's also a sense of absolute dependence where we realize that this entire thing, taken whole as world, and us as a part of it, is not a product of spontaneity, but somehow that whole, the entirety, right, not within it, not the causes within it, which are dependent on each other, but somehow the whole has a dependence upon something else. Now, as a philosopher, I'm going to say this seems like a weak point, but what he's trying to use this to name is a sense that he feels he's experienced, which is distinctive from all the relationships he has within the world, and which coheres with the idea that somehow this is an experience of something which is separate from world altogether, because it doesn't fit those categories. And that's what he's going to talk about in terms of a feeling of absolute dependence. And he thinks this sense of absolute dependence is inescapable in a sense, unceasing as long as we be, as long as we're self-conscious. And it's a sense of what we don't originate control. I'm repeating myself a bit here. So it's a sense of an absolute dependence vis-a-vis the whole world, where the world is the self with the different dimensions that we just talked about, and the other. And this is an absolute dependence of the whole upon something else, where that is not given. All right. So as regards the identification, I'm now quoting, of absolute dependence with relation to God in our proposition, this is to be understood in the sense that the whence of our receptive and active existence, as implied in this self-consciousness, is to be designated by the word God, and that this is for us the really original signification of that word. Let me see what's on my next slide. So God is not the whole of the temporal world, for we have a feeling of freedom vis-a-vis everything in the world, right? We can, it's divided up in the world. There's a receptivity, there's a back and forth. Nor is God in this sense dependent upon prior knowledge of God, right? So I don't know God through information given from within the world, but only an idea of God where and don't bring in all sorts of other baggage, and baggage sounds negative, but for him it is. Other ideas. This is the fundamental notion of God. This is I wanted to see if I had it here. So I think it's one of the slides come up. This is the original revelation, right? So where does the idea of God originally come from before you're getting it from a book or from your parents or from how you're raised? And this is what he means. This is not that all that is wrong, but if you go to that, then you're within the world. You're appealing to tradition. You're appealing to the authority of one way of talking versus another. That becomes an appeal to authority that's illegitimate. What he's trying to gesture towards is some sort of awareness that he thinks we can all have about a whence of the whole. Which we can, and of course you can shut this off. You can just think in terms. You can direct your attention downward and not open yourself to this. But for anyone who's opened themselves to it and thought through the whole, they'll have a sense of this absolute dependence, the whence of all existence, which goes to something beyond each of us in our worlds or beyond the self-world conglomerate. All right. So on this ground, Schleiermacher effectively dispatches with the modern arguments for the existence of God, the teleological, the cosmological, the ontological, because they all trade upon appeals to ideas or causes or factors within the world, as well as all arguments from miracles, because miracles are talking about events, again, in the world, and all their defeaters. So the entire complex of what's by his time begun to emerge, remember, he's contemporary of Paley, right, the watchmaker God. So these arguments for the existence of God are in full swing. He is simply setting them all aside with this approach and trying to find another way of, and I think here argument's not quite the right term, and this is where I think we're doing philosophical theology in the phenomenological tradition, not in the modern analytic or epistemological tradition, because it's not an argument from things or observations in the world. It's an attempt to awaken one to a consciousness of the whole, which is there for anyone who's awakened to it, but from which we can be distracted or cut off. That entire philosophical enterprise, arguing for and against the existence of God in relation to relations within the world, and that is the proper realm of science. I mean, there's a place for doing that, but now you should be doing science, and this is where science is about things in the world, not about God, and things of God are not about science. We're going to see him working this through, because he's going to look to separate what theology is from what science is in such a way that he can affirm modern science and the natural world wholesale, while also leaving space for affirmation of God. And so he thinks this whole philosophical enterprise, kind of the modern Western, especially Anglophone attempt to develop arguments for God, and then you have the counter-arguments of God, that all of that is misconstrued, misbegotten, because it turns on the expectation that God is somehow part of the order of the world. In the same sense, the feeling of absolute dependence is not an experience in the empiricist scientific sense. He's not denying that sort of experience. These are experiences within the world. But it's important to distinguish that sort of experience, which is within a world, from the sense that somehow the whole is dependent and has a whence, which is other than the world. All right. So, for Schleiermacher, no encounter with any other within the world is absolute dependence, only relative dependence, including the idea or concept of God, right? So once God becomes an idea or a concept, God is within the world. It's only as one opens oneself to this absolute dependence, the feeling of absolute dependence, this awareness of that one is in contact with the divine. If we speak then, he says, of an original revelation of God to man or in man, the meaning will always be just this, that along with the absolute dependence which characterizes not only all people, but all temporal existence, there is given to humans also the immediate self-consciousness of it, which becomes a consciousness of God insofar as we realize that we are not wholly sufficient, that we are somehow resting in something else. So this is for him what revelation is originally. And again, I think really, so this is all kind of technical. There's some ways in which I find it unconvincing, although, again, it's worth your time to kind of think through because it's an interesting approach to reality. And I think that really this is where he's trying to take an experience he's had, which he doesn't think is adequately explained by any scientific explanation. And really, you could include nature and nurture here. And it's not explained by being something that's a product of his own creative ideas. It's an experience of being held in a different way, which I think he has in the Moravian community. Which is this fundamental reality, the fundamental sense of being held, that he's trying to identify and locate it with philosophical precision, because he sees the cultural despisers, his friends, who are wholly taken up by the parameters of modern rationality, cut off from being able to name and so be awakened to and celebrate this reality. At the same time, he doesn't want to reject the modern science and rationality that they are caught up in. So again, this is not an either or, it's a yes and. So he's going to want to affirm modern science and philosophy while saying it's not exhaustive in what it takes account of in our experience, where experience is not delimited within the bounds of empiricism. So note here that Schleiermacher's basic appeal to revelation is not made in terms of any appeal to any historical revelation, right? So there's lots of people, they'll appeal to Scripture. He recognizes that appeals to Scripture, creed, and tradition already. Then you need a defense. Well, why I think this Scripture is true? Why I think this creed or this tradition is true? There's going to be no argument that justifies that. And this is already within his context. We're just talking about multiple Christian creeds, let alone a context within which we can think of all sorts of different philosophical and religious traditions, and the inability to argue. It's the whole thing's misbegotten from his perspective. It's this feeling of absolute dependence, which you're trying to awaken, and it's that is the original revelation, which these scriptures and traditions are about. So he's certainly going to have a strong role for Scripture and tradition. He's going to have a strong way, we'll see, of affirming Jesus and having a Christology. But that all of that is going to explain this fundamental reality, which we experience first. In a sense, we can say, getting ahead of myself here, but I'll stop. In this sense, too, as with Wesley, frankly, as with most every major theologian, the apophatic, the mystical, is going to have priority over the cataphatic. But Schleiermacher is going to try and give that priority philosophical and logical legitimacy. All right, so I'm going to just move to the next slide. So, in whatever measure this actually takes place, in other words, in whatever measure we are completely open to the whence of absolute dependence in God, all right, whatever this actually takes place effectively during the course of a personality through time, in just that measure, he says, we ascribe piety to the individual. And this would be a way, for instance, that he would interpret the whole notion of living in the world, to be in the world, the admonition to be in the world, but not of it. In the world is to be, in the world where it's me and other, and there's causes and all this stuff that happens within the world, and we're in the world, but not of it, means to be living in the world with a constant awareness of our absolute dependence upon that which is without the world, which is the whence of all. Okay. And this will figure later in his Christology. So whatever measure this actually takes place during the course of a personality through time, in just that measure do we ascribe piety to the individual. In Jesus Christ we have the person, Schleiermacher says, in which the God consciousness is always triumphant and always present, even unto death on a cross. And so that's where Jesus Christ's piety is the ultimate, the perfect piety, the veritable God in him, we'll see him say. Okay, on the other hand, any possibility of God being in any way given, that is, in the world, is entirely excluded. because anything that is outwardly given must be given as an object exposed to our counter-influence, however slight this may be. And with God, there's no sense of a counter-influence, right? There's a sense of absolute dependence. And in normal Christian terminology, this would often be spoken of in terms of the omniscience of God. The omnipotence of God, the omniscient power of God. All right. The religious self-consciousness, he then argues, leads necessarily in its development to fellowship or communion, a church. And this gives him what he's going to call a scientific theory of morals, because this fellowship is demanded by the consciousness of kind, which dwells in every human, and which finds its satisfaction only when one steps forth beyond the limits of one's own personality and takes up the facts of other personalities into one's own. And it's accomplished through the fact that everything inward becomes at a certain point of its strength and maturity, of course I'm quoting here, and outward too, and as such perceptible to others, a revelation of the inward. It's a sense in which in some ways I only know myself to the degree I am known, which kind of became a trendy psychological insight in the late 20th century. So you begin with the barest expression of feeling, a smile, a tear, and it's as we have these feelings and we see ourselves have them in a sense, and we see others seeing us have them, that we begin to inhabit a world and a kind of world. In other words, again, there's not a radical atomism here. It's not even thinkable from his perspective, and to the degree one is isolating oneself, one then harms oneself. One we crave fellowship. I'm making this tape in the middle of COVID, when in some ways this truth is as evident as it always has been to many of us. There is something about being with others, being in community, inhabiting life together, having feelings which are shared together, which is essential to development. And for him, it's a satisfaction. He doesn't want people limited to their own personality and opened up. At the same time, he recognizes there's going to be this quote continues what I was just saying. So. What he's saying here is we already find ourselves in these sorts of communities, but what he's saying is these communities are such that even if they didn't exist, we'd look to find them, to make them, to find people to be in fellowship with. Now, and this will go to the next slide, different folks have different personalities. I'm not quoting at this point, but this is what he says, moving on. And so there's going to be different modes of expression, different traditions and so forth, which are independent of piety. So the piety is again opening to that absolute dependence. But within the world, because there's different personalities, different traditions, different kinds of people, there was going to be different sorts of piety. At the same time, none of these differences will be so great that the piety cannot be recognized, that wince and sense of absolute dependence. So for him, diversity in this sense is natural and no threat. And as we'll see, for him, thus diversity is a diversity he's affirming among various Christian traditions. In theory, we could expand this into religiously, I believe, but that will maybe touch on that a little bit later. That is not a presenting issue for Schleiermacher in Central Europe at this time. Which is to say, then, that insofar as piety is recognized in all the modes of expression and traditions which result from opening to absolute dependence, sectarianism is unjustified. Right? They say, oh no, only my way of doing it is a faithful way. To the contrary, a plurality within the bounds of piety should be celebrated. And so, again, this is an affirmation of a diversity, but not a radical relativity. And it is, again, one, I mean, as I say often in my books, there's no faith tradition in the world that has been acknowledged as a faith tradition that says exploit your neighbor and ignore the poor. That would be a way of saying all these faith traditions, insofar as they say, love your neighbor, care for the poor, which is common among every major faith tradition in the world, they're all within the bounds of piety. Now, Schleiermacher is not going to that degree, but you can see how this idea would be congruent with that affirmation. So, Well, that last sentence, I won't read it because I've just said it in other words, so I'll just let that do. So, naturally, like will group with like in a relatively closed religious communion, which forms an ever self-renewing circulation of the religious self-consciousness within certain definite limits, and a propagation of the religious emotions arranged and organized within the same limits. This we designate a church. And remember, based on what he just said, there might be very many different sorts of churches. It again is very helpful, I think, to think of him here describing the Moravian community and how within that Moravian community he was awakened to this sense of absolute dependence, the whence to God, and he finds this ever self-renewing circulation of the religious self-consciousness. At the same time, he doesn't want to say, well, only the Moravians. He wants to leave space for a plurality as long as there's a commonality. So he's going to see, based on what we said about Wesley, in the Wesleyan community, a diversity within piety, which he would be able to affirm. Okay, so that's my attempt to go after this really complicated idea, really famous but often misunderstood or only understood as kind of a forward clip of the idea of feeling of absolute dependence. All right, so let's go now to something that's related, and it's also excerpted, as was this last selection, from the Christian Faith, his magnum opus, and this is on God and the world. So, based on what we've said, for Schleiermacher, there are no gaps in the world in the sphere of receptivity, spontaneity. So, God is, in this sense, totaliter, wholly other, eternal, where eternal is not a temporal reference. That is, eternal is not everlasting time, a lot of moments in time, for that would make God temporal, a creature. Eternal names that which is outside of time. That's how he's going to understand Alpha and Omega, not as two temporal references, but as a gesture to the eternal, which is outside of time altogether. And this, of course, will be going along with him having God as that sense of absolute dependence, which is the sense of the eternal. So to attribute an event in the world where it's a matter of its relative dependencies and what's around it in the world, and then its spontaneities as well, right? So to attribute an event in the world that cannot be explained to God, right? The so-called God of the gaps. So this would be his response in particular to, for instance, Paley's argument. Saying that, well, we can't explain how an eye came about, so it must be that God came into the flow to make this happen, so we could have something complicated like an eye develop. And for Schleiermacher, this is to confuse the God-world relation, for it violates God's transcendence by inserting God within the causal flow of the world. So again, for Schleiermacher, God is not an object of knowledge. Objects of knowledge are everything in the world, and that's susceptible then to scientific analysis. But God is not in the world in this sense, cannot be seen. As Barth will say a century later, God is the subject of faith, not the object of knowledge. Of course, Barth, let me not get off into the Barth Schleiermacher thing now. All right, so a complete natural scientific explanation within the world is no threat to faith in God, who is no part of the world. So this means Schleiermacher has inoculated theology, at least in his vein, from Darwin ahead of time. So the Christian Faith appears in 1821-22. Darwin's On the Origins of the Species appears in 1859. But because of Schleiermacher's understanding that the whole causal flow of the world is going to happen within the world order, right, not with God coming in and doing things, then the Origins of the Species, even if we think, as it was at the time, right, it needs the later synthesis with, what's his name? The guy who started out the genetics, the different seeds and stuff that comes together, that later Darwinian synthesis, he even if there's gaps in our understanding of where the species came from, those don't point to God. Those points to places where you need more scientific exploration. All right, that on Schleiermacher's theology and philosophy already ahead of time. All right. So, moreover, insofar as one has an unqualified conviction that everything is grounded and established in the universality of the nature system, and the inner certainty of the absolute dependence of all finite being upon God, then one has the possibility of pious self-consciousness in every moment of the objective self-consciousness, and the possibility of complete world consciousness in every moment of pious self-consciousness. And this is a kind of a complicated way for him to say there is no opposition between modern science and the modern vision of the world and faith and living open to one's absolute dependence upon God. So one can live in absolute dependence upon God, wholly awakened to that, as one proceeds and engages in scientific analysis and engagement within the causal, social, or political, or natural structures of the world, and vice versa. So God's conservation of the world is everywhere real, but nowhere does it constitute a causal intervention within the causal stream of events in the world. This means that miracles, as they are commonly understood then and now, mistakenly insert God within the causal stream of the world. Thereby, miracles violate the integrity of creation of the world, and they confuse the categories of world and God. And they suggest, he says, even that divine wisdom in creation is lacking. It raises a problem of evil, because suddenly God is immediately, liable for not intervening at any given point, and also for having a lack in how God sets up the world. Now, maybe in your mind, as in mine, there are lots of questions getting raised immediately at all these points, but I'm going to try not to go off into the questions, but first to kind of get a sense for his thought, and then, later is when we get more advanced, maybe, and ask the questions and engage. So he says it is not theologically reasonable to posit or expect miracles. Thinking in terms of miracles, says Schleiermacher, is magical thinking. And this for him would be, this is where faith is not magical, but notions of anywhere in which God is in the world, right, violating the causal flow, that becomes magical thinking. So it's irrational and fosters false understanding and unrealistic expectations. So the world is not, however, a nature mechanism alone, but nature mechanism and free agents. So the receptivity, spontaneity, in a sense, that is what names each of us. And then, of course, God is outside of the whole world. So the world is nature mechanism plus receptivity, spontaneity, free agents. And this is essentially how secular folks, modern secular rationality sees the world. One great, and we've moved from mechanistic to organic metaphors, but nonetheless, there's a sense of a causal flow, maybe with some indeterminacy in there. None of that funds free agents, but there's a strong belief and desire for authenticity and for free will. And so that's us. Of course, we realize we're not completely free. We're free within the bounds of our nature and nurture formation. This is where Schleiermacher's already living in the modern world. And so in trying to articulate a theology that can go together with that vision of the modern world without conflating the various categories. As I think I say later, he doesn't seem to have fully been aware of the fact that the notion of free will also constitutes an intervention within the nature mechanism, which is a little bit inconsistent with the nature mechanism. But again, he's here no worse off than what I think is today mainstream modern Western secular rationality, which tends to affirm both science and authenticity in the sense of free will. Of course, there's also naturalistic or metaphysical naturalism, And that is a form of rationality which is actually now predominant among elite Anglophone philosophers, and this would deny free will. They don't deny that we have a sense of free will, but they deny the reality of it because the nature mechanism rules. That is not Schleiermacher's position. In this way, he already is very much consistent with secular rationality, except he thinks secular rationality misses the overt naming of the radical dependence of the whole upon God, which is the whence of all, and which for him is what we experience in the sorts of mystical moments that we have in religious communities. So the one great miracle, the mission of Christ, has, of course, the aim of restoration, but it is the restoration of what free causes have altered in their own province. This looks like a free will defense of evil to me, that he's setting up in that degree. So roughly, not in that of the nature mechanism or in the course of things originally ordained by God. So again, this sets up sort of the free will defense. The way God set up everything, the world should have been just wonderful, but then because of human free will, that was corrupted, and that's why we have the world we have. Now, I think most of this would judge this maybe to be lacking, but before getting into critique and a constructive critique, it's important to kind of see the moves he's making, the possibilities he's opening up, and to acknowledge that his stance in terms of the affirmation of the nature mechanism and the nature mechanism plus free agents and that plus faith is probably does describe for many modern 21st century people of faith, does generally outline their understanding of the world and gives it some sense. So this is not deism, and it's not pantheism or even panentheism. For Schleiermacher, the divine action is real and constant. So as we do theology, there's different ways of envisioning the God-world relation. Deism was one modern alternative, right? And that's actually Paley's watchmaker God is basically the deist God, right? The engineer who designs the perfect watch and then gets it going and it goes off. And so for deism, there's a God, but this God creates the world and now it goes off on its own, and that's why we can. And there's also free will, right? In most deist things, there's not a denial of free will, so that they also have the kind of the free will defense for evil in there. For panentheism, God is just the world in the whole. Or panentheism, God is somehow embedded in the world. These two visions are too difficult to kind of put and draw, so I didn't put them, and let me not go into them further now. We can discuss them later if you're in one of my classes, or when we treat other people who are actually pantheist or panentheist. My own position, which I'm not going to be doing here, would actually be panentheist, so I'm not leaving out people to dismiss them. It's just that it's not easy to explain now. The popular God that Schleiermacher is concerned, though, to undercut because it doesn't fit with the modern view of the world, and because we'll talk about this more. But remember his experiences in the Berlin hospital and with the battle at Hale, and because this notion of God can lead to disappointed expectations. The popular God is one who interjects here. You can see in these points comes within so this is the natural flow. The popular God comes in and interrupts it and makes changes, right? For Schleiermacher, God is a constant presence in the flow of the world. The constant, everywhere available, everywhere there, as available to us if we open ourselves up to this feeling of absolute dependence in God as the whence of the whole, right? The eternal, which is not in time, but is above time. So I'm doing this because it's popular God, but for Schleiermacher, this God is everywhere, right? And maybe in dependence, I should put Schleiermacher underneath, pointing up, but nonetheless, the popular God tends to be out here and then intervenes at various points in the world. And then for deism, the God is ahead of time, and then you have the causal flow. And of course, for deism and for, as I was just saying, for popular thought, individual free will kind of can intervene in this way. And Schleiermacher has that in terms of our spontaneity, what we can do, and not just our receptivity. But this is one way to think about the God-world relationship for Schleiermacher. Okay, so note on miracles, pre and first post the scientific revolution. So in Schleiermacher, and indeed for modern thought generally, including for most people today, a miracle is taken to mean a break in the natural causal flow, which is attributable to a transcendent intervention. So this is the sense in which miracles are taken to be supernatural, with natural understood in a modern sense. All right. So I need to specify transcendent intervention because by the same token, every exercise of free will is likewise miraculous. In other words, it's an extra natural break in the natural flow. Free will designates to a conscious, reasoned choice, a decision that I make where I could do one of two things. So it's neither indeterminism nor is it determinate. That's why for metaphysical naturalists and elite Anglophone philosophers who are committed to metaphysical naturalism, it's really the dogma of our day, there is no such thing as free will. It might not be the future follows necessarily from the past, but that's not because there's free will, it's only because there's indeterminacy built into the system. Now, it doesn't seem to me that Schleiermacher is fully aware of this issue. It was an issue of the day. Kant overtly condemns this notion of determinism. Hume, by contrast, affirms it, as does Hobbes and others in the day. But this doesn't rise up in the same way for Schleiermacher. And this is, as I just said, this is why mainstream modern Western Anglophone intellectual elites, at least among philosophers, consider the idea of free will on the whole. They consider it to be a delusion, although some of them caution it's a very important delusion because it's rooted to notions of causal, of rather responsibility or blame or all of these sorts of things, self-identity, authenticity. So some of them argue it's not real, but it's evolved as a societally essential meme. So keep quiet about it. Anyway, the point I want to make here is that this is a wholly modern way of understanding miracles. Right, it's a violation of a law of nature. This notion of laws of nature is a product of the scientific revolution. So this way of thinking about miracles as an interruption in the deterministic causal flow is a wholly modern way of thinking. That's why in the biblical stories, all sorts of people were thought capable of extraordinary acts, and what designated a miracle in the biblical sense was the source of the power for the act. So the occurrence of the miracle in itself proved nothing spiritually significant. The question always was, by what power, right? So by what power does Jesus do these things, right? Is this of God, or is this of the devil, or some other source? Remember, that's the question. And so this is a sense in which Schleiermacher is going to reject miracles in the sense of a break in the natural order. That's a confusion. But he's going to see Jesus Christ, in the way we're going to talk, as the one miracle. But this is a miracle which will not constitute a break in the natural order. And in this sense, you could say, although once Schleiermacher denies miracles in the modern sense, it's easy to think, well, he's denying what everyone's always thought about miracles in the biblical sense as well. Well, that's not true. In the essential biblical sense of asking, is this of God, or is this of some other force that we should be aware of? In that sense, he's going to say the one miracle of Christ is the miracle, is the answer he's giving in the precise biblical sense. And this other understanding of miracle that he's rejecting is curiously both indexed to a modern natural conception, even as it's a violation of it. So again, you have a tempest from this perspective in a modern teapot, which leads all sorts of people astray. All right. Now, for many people, all this will eventually or quickly raise the question, especially people of faith, of course, if there are no miracles, because God does not intervene in the causal flow of nature, then what am I praying for? And this takes us to our next reading, the power of prayer in relation to outward circumstances. So, to be perfectly religious and to pray without ceasing are for Schleiermacher the same thing, because perfect piety is living in this world, but not of it. That is, to be perfectly religious is to live in this world wholly receptive and guided in our spontaneity by our openness to awareness of our absolute dependence upon God. So that's what for Schleiermacher it means to pray without ceasing, which is to be pious always, which is to live always out of our awareness of our absolute dependence upon God, right, who is this constant force flowing upon us insofar as we're open to it, and the whence of the whole. Now, with one exception, Schleiermacher says, and that's Jesus Christ, humans imperfectly pray without ceasing. We all at various times fail to be open and receptive and reacting in light of our whole sense of our absolute dependence upon God. So there are still, though, some real benefits of prayer, and by this now he means not the praying without ceasing, which can permeate an entire life, but the actual turning to pray is a dedicated activity, which of course is an exercise of trying to open ourselves, right, by directing ourselves to this absolute dependence in a way that we hope would then sustain us always. But as to the benefit of the prayer in this sense, surely we have all experienced it, right? So he knows people are going to say, well, why am I praying? What's the benefit of the prayer if it doesn't change something, right? And so he's we're going to get to the point. He's nice. This is coming out of a sermon, by the way. This is a sermon, and so he's pastoral. But maybe I won't be quite as pastoral in saying, the bottom line he thinks is if you're only praying so you can get God to do something for you, this is a pretty self-centered exercise. And if that's all you think God is good for, then your understanding of prayer is pretty impoverished. So he's going to make the positive move on this. And so he knows this background question's out there. And as to the benefit of prayer, there can be no question. Surely we have all experienced it. So now he's going to give all these ways in which we've experienced, he hopes, the benefits of prayer, which have nothing to do with asking God to change something in the world on our behalf. All right. So if our joys have often remained innocent, while others have strayed into ways of sin, if our judgments have been mixed with gentleness and modesty, where pride and arrogance might most easily have gained the day, if we have been guarded from the evil which the judgment of men all too willingly excuses, then we owe this beneficent protection to prayer. And this, again, is not magical. This is the effect of opening ourselves to the feeling of absolute dependence, opening ourselves to the divine, to the whence of the whole, which orients us in a wholly different way than if we stay within what we want, within the order of the world. Right? That's how this prayer works, by opening us to the reality of God. This is a reality that we experience for Him. Note that basically this is existentially, spiritually identical to Wesley's understanding of perfection in faith and the Moravian ideal for faith, right? And again, Schleiermacher is raised in the Moravian community, right? Where what stillness is, prayer is to take the time, right? And to get to the point where you allow the divine to reorient your desires. So what you want is now what is loving and good. That would be perfection and sanctification for Wesley. That would be reaching the third highest phase from the Moravians, where you're looking for the Moravians, and that you see articulated here in Schleiermacher, but now on top of an attempt to give a rigorous understanding, philosophical and theologically, of how he can talk about this and frame this understanding while affirming the modern understanding of the world as a nature mechanism. So, he says, he understands this, but if, not in terms of our faith, piety, God consciousness, but if within the world, if we think of prayer as means to effect change, even for good, then, and this is what I was referring to a second ago, then what a narrowing of our mental condition. So what is the narrowing? Well, our hopes are too narrowly focused upon happiness within the world. The spiritual dynamic can become self-interested, utilitarian. Now I'm praying to get something, right? Not praying in order to be transformed by God, but praying in order to get God to do something, as if, it's assertive. It's the opposite of piety, he wants to say, this sort of prayer. And he also has a pastoral concern. If we expect prayer to change events within the world, and he'll say this, I'm not just making this up, he says this, we will be frequently disappointed. And here I think you can never forget Schleiermacher's years of chaplaincy in the Berlin hospital, right? Before the discovery of anesthetics, or even the discovery of germs and the need for use of antiseptics. Just imagine, again, what Schleiermacher witnesses in his years as a chaplain at Berlin's largest hospital, and at the battle for Hall. So Schleiermacher has repeated intimate acquaintance with desperate prayers and disappointed expectations. And I have trouble not thinking that he is not also desperately concerned to reorient people properly to save them from that sense. And you might have parishioners, or others, friends, think this way, that somehow something awful that's happened to them or their family is because they have done something wrong, because they have failed, right? Or they didn't pray or believe enough. Didn't trust God enough. And so there can be tremendous disappointment, disillusionment, loss of faith, self-blame, self-harm that results from this confusion. And that's where Schleiermacher will speak in these abstract technical terms, but you have to keep track of his life to understand that this is connecting to reality. I get annoyed when people speak about people like Schleiermacher as these ivory tower types. He is anything but that in his life experience. What he is trying to bring the most advanced intellectual reflection together with his faith and affirmation of the divine to the realities of the world. All right. Moreover, whether we think God has said yes, and so we're tempted to think perhaps we're especially favored, or no, and perhaps we are led to worry we are out of favor. Let's think of friends of Job here, with their misplaced comments. In both cases, our attention is directed to the world and to our own desires, which again is the opposite of piety and true prayer. And this is all that leads to a narrowing of our mental condition. So what then of petitionary prayer, he says. This is a category, so we're going to have this what of petitionary prayer, we asked. Well, he says, consider Jesus' prayer at Gethsemane, Matthew 26, 36 to 46. And this is the text that is for the sermon he's preaching under this. Again, this is a sermon. I'm not sure you get together with a sermon, get away with a sermon quite like this today. It's a little bit tight and technical. And I'm going to let you read that text on your own because you have time to. You can just pause the tape and read that text. I think I left it there long enough for that. So this is Jesus' prayer at Gethsemane. This is right before he's going to face the cross, and Gethsemane is overlooking Jerusalem. So it's a life and death context, right? So at such points, Schleiermacher says, even those furthest from true piety tend to turn toward God. And so this would be the famous Foxhole Prayers that we hear about people in extreme, foxholes in a war zone. And of course, with Schleiermacher, we're talking about someone who literally was in a war zone. And so again, these are not abstract references for Schleiermacher. He has no doubt concrete memories of people making prayers, even those who are the furthest from piety, and they make this sort of prayer. And Schleiermacher first, again, this is pastoral and right, I think. He stresses that it's good and right to turn to God in such moments. He says we should be honest about our fears, hopes, and desires, and honestly name them in prayer as petitions. As long as, of course, they're not sinful in and of themselves, right? But to say the things, this is what I want for my mom, or for my daughter, or for myself. That is to be honest before God. And this is what Jesus does at Gethsemane. Jesus does not want to die at the cross. Who would? Right? The question is not this is something that Jesus wants, or not something that Jesus should want. No one would want that. We can be honest about these desires, honest about our fears. Schleiermacher wants that, and he sees this modeled in Jesus here. At the same time, you don't pray with the expectation or intent to effect change. At least not changing anything else, right? I mean, if we're talking about the change in ourselves, well, then that is a reason to pray, as we'll see. So again, the idea that we're praying to change things out there, to have God intervene in the world, again, this is a confused spiritual orientation. It participates in magical thinking. It's liable then to great disappointment and to misplaced hopes. And it's not piety in this sense for Schleiermacher. It's not true prayer. So he says, what is then petitionary prayer? Ask and you will receive what? Well, again, consider Jesus at Gethsemane. And note then, there's 3 times Jesus prays here and 3 different responses. And there's a progression that Schleiermacher sees. Now, this is not Jesus ever failing to be pious. This is going to be a moment, and for Schleiermacher, really, this is the unto death on a cross. This is the life and death moment, where what comes first? My desire for survival, literally, or my desire to be faithful to God, to remain faithful to God. So this is Jesus' pious consciousness. This is Jesus' piety triumphing, right, at this ultimate moment, really, of his life. The triumph of his piety over what might be seen as human natural desires, right? So the first prayer is just an honest expression. Let this cup pass. I don't want to do this. The second prayer, let this cup pass, but if not, change me, right? Your will be done. And the third prayer, he just ends and he proceeds with a calm spirit and holy firmness. So I'll here give you the passage again, highlighting those things. He took with him Peter and 2 sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and agitated. Okay, there's an honesty in Jesus here. This is a realistic portrait of someone who's facing death on a cross. And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed. All right, so the threw himself on the ground and prayed. I mean, this is a Jesus who is passionate. And my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want. Again, so there's the true piety coming through in that yet. And then the second time, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, he says. He goes away the second time. And my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. Right? So not let this cup pass from me, but if it cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. A step further there. And then the third time he goes back prays for the third time, saying the same words, but this time he comes back and he says, the hour is at hand, right? And he comes to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand. And note, he's now calm. This is what Schleiermacher's seen. He's now calm. He's disciplined. He's no longer, worried and upset. The disciples are sleeping. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let us be going. See, my betrayers are at hand. This is rapidly the piety of Jesus overcoming Jesus' natural desire not to suffer in the world. All right, this is the triumph of the God consciousness in him, which petitionary prayer, right, leads him to. So petitionary prayer is honest, but in the end, the goal of petitionary prayer is not to change some outward circumstance through some magical intervention, but to change oneself. So that one has piety in the face of the outward circumstances. All right, so this is what I was just saying. And so, go here to this bottom part. I just said this. You can pause the tape and see it if you want. But Jesus is increasingly reconciled to God's will, and this is the real drama here for Schleiermacher. This is where Jesus is fully human. Jesus is praying here. It's the real deal, right? In theory, Jesus may have said, "Let's get out of here." I'll find another way to make these changes, right? But he doesn't do that. He remains firm to what is God's will in this time. And this is a sense in which Jesus is God incarnate, because at every state, Jesus' God consciousness triumphs. And after praying the third time, he's rejuvenated as well as aligned to the divine will. He abandons all pleas for deliverance, and he moves resolutely forward, faithful to his call to speak love to power, even under the cross. All right. So, remember that God is constant and unchanging in terms of the power of prayer in relation to outward circumstances. Remember that God is constant and unchanging. Prayer does not change that constancy. Does not change God's faithfulness, as if you don't pray, somehow God will be less faithful, less constant. It is not sometimes yes and sometimes no. The grace of God is constant, a continual yes. In this world, however, evil may overtake you. It may easily be, is a voice that reaches us from 1,000 examples, says Schleiermacher. And again, there can be no doubt that Schleiermacher has memories from his days as pastor at the Berlin hospital, sitting with terrified, suffering patients and counseling grieving families. There are those who fell during the Battle of Hall. And then there's the death of his beloved mother, just after he leaves for boarding school with the Moravians as a teen. No doubt much more, right? He has been in circumstances where the world has come, of course, his entire world blows up when Napoleon sweeps through Hall when he's 38. Things that you think could never happen, it may easily be. This is the realism he brings in, even as he affirms the constancy and the faithfulness of God. So why evil, suffering, and death? Well, we don't know. Nobody knows. But what do we know? That's what Schleiermacher wants to stress. God is good, whatever befalls us. So we can be confident that God is good in the end. God will somehow, and the end will somehow triumph. That should be not he. God, good, confident God, good, in the end will somehow triumph. So we can cry, Father, thy will be done. So general emphasis, when you benefit, it's not divine favoritism. When you suffer, it's not divine disfavor. For instance, by worldly standards, Jesus' life was a complete failure, at least if you judged it right after the cross. Destitute, almost wholly abandoned and executed at 33 years of age. But to put it mildly, the common conclusion is not that Jesus was a failure. So do not be of this world and judge as this world judges. Two, the highest aspect in all forms of prayer is the prayer we offer when we have the living thought of God accompanying, purifying, and sanctifying all other thoughts, feelings, and purposes. And then petitionary prayer should be a rare form of prayer, he says, because it's full of temptations to misunderstanding and impiety, right, as we've discussed. Selfishness, manipulative intent, a lack of confidence in God's goodness and constancy. What is true prayer on the whole? But of course, there's a place for petitionary prayer. He wants us to be honest about our doubts, honest about our needs, honest about our desperation. But he closes then, what is true prayer? True prayer is a heart-stirring thought of the Creator. When our eye rests on his works, out of the quiet delight which we take in God's creation, a thought of the ruler of the world, checking our false estimates amidst our talk of the fortunes and undertakings of people, a sense of the one whose image becomes manifest in us when we feel ourselves overflowing with love and goodwill amidst the social enjoyment of those noble human feelings, a glad sense of God's love when we are enjoying God's gifts, when we succeed in some good work, a thankful sense of God's support. That's all true prayer for him. And by the way, this is all ways of describing, in non-philosophical, non-technical terms, what the feeling of absolute dependence amounts to. Right? So this is where you get the passion that he's trying to name with this feeling of absolute dependence, which is not reducible to things within the world, not just a psychological sort of response or sociological response, something that's actually real in a different sense. So when we meditate on God's commandments, what is true prayer? When we meditate on God's commandments, the great hope that God wishes to raise us to God's own likeness, this is true prayer, the blessings of which I heartily desire we may all abundantly enjoy. So in some way, he's close to Leibniz's theodicy here, the idea that somehow, in the end, it must be, everything works out for the best. But Schleiermacher, in the end, doesn't offer a theory, an explanation. There is, though, a picture. The picture is of the closed nature mechanism, but free agents. Again, this appears to me to be a bit of a fault line in his thought, but it's just one to name. I actually would have the same fault line in my thought. I want to affirm both these things as well. Words are means. They are significant, but they're never the focus, the point. There is a transcendent beyond the signified, so the words are within the natural order, but the words can be useful to help to witness to that which is beyond, that which is manifest through the feeling of absolute dependence. This is where I think there's a deep connection to his hermeneutics that is not noticed by modern philosophy, because it separates his hermeneutics from his theology. Anyway, there's a focus upon spiritual union, transformation, upon saving grace, upon immediate impetus to good works. Like Wesley, though, there's a priority of the apophatic, which is prior to the cataphatic. Right? So all this theory, all these words are not the thing. They are attempts to open, to name, again, like theology in this sense is like poetry, where the poetry in this sense is not the thing. The poetry is what gives you somehow access, awakening to, a way to name, and so to be more empowered by, to more inhabit the reality about which, towards which the poetry is gesturing. Now, this might sound kind of radical, but actually when I was preparing this lecture one year, a person who's very conservative Christian shared this with me from their daily devotional. This is, again, from 1843 to 1934, so maybe this person was actually directly influenced by Schleiermacher. But this is compare the spirituality of this really quite a daily devotional book that is very familiar to conservative Christians. And this is what it says: "Be anxious for nothing." This is a commentary on this verse. And let me just read what the F.W. Robertson writes about this, that they decide to excerpt here. I'm pretty sure Robertson is influenced by Schleiermacher at this point. "That prayer which does not succeed in moderating our wish, in changing the passionate desire into still submission, the anxious, tumultuous expectation into silent surrender, is no true prayer, and proves that we have not the spirit of true prayer. That life is most holy, in which there is least of petition and desire, and most of waiting upon God. That in which petition most often passes into thanksgiving. Pray till prayer makes you forget your own wish, and leave it or merge it in God's will. The divine wisdom has given us prayer, not as a means whereby to obtain the good things of earth, but as a means whereby we learn to do without them. Not as a means whereby we escape evil, but as a means whereby we become strong to meet it." I am going to leave this for another time, because I think I've gone more than long enough on this, and this is going to be the end of part one of my two-part discussion of major theological themes in Schleiermacher.